The Sahara is the world's largest desert, and crossing it is only possible thanks to scattered oases that provide life-sustaining water to travelers along the way. For those untrained in handling it, the Sahara is a place of death and despair. This was certainly true for millions of slaves who were dragged in chains across that burning desert for 1,000 years. This Trans-Saharan slave trade is easily overlooked, thanks to its more famous Atlantic cousin. But the exchange of unfree people across the desert was a longer-lasting and possibly larger system that deserves much more attention. Today, on A Day in History, we look at the brutality of the Trans-Saharan slave trade and how this institution of slavery and suffering stood for over 1,000 years. Slavery within and around the Sahara is as ancient as civilization. Ancient Egyptians extracted slaves from adjacent regions in modern-day Sudan and Libya. Later, Phoenician settlers along the fertile Mediterranean coast, most notably Carthage, established slave trading networks that included slaves taken from all areas of the Mediterranean Basin. But the scattered inhabitants of the Sahara could not satisfy the growing demand for slaves forever. Eventually, traders began using the Sahara as a passageway to access and enslave the people of sub-Saharan Africa. Historians are unsure who began the Trans-Saharan slave trade or when. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BC, described a people called the Garamentines from Libya, who allegedly used their chariots to hunt down Ethiopian slaves. And some historians say they were the first Trans-Saharan slavers. However, there is no material evidence of these vast slave trading networks, and it's more likely these were just slave raids deeper into the Sahara and not a true Trans-Saharan slave trading system. Small numbers of sub-Saharan Africa slaves existed in Roman North Africa by the 300s. Artwork recovered from Roman villas shows figures who seem to be black Africans working in fields and hunting, showing that at least some slave trading across the desert existed by this point. However, it wasn't until the arrival of Islam and the Arabs to North Africa that a larger, sustained system of slave trading emerged. Arab armies conquered most of North Africa by the early 8th century. The unified Abbasid Caliphate connected the Islamic world religiously and economically, and slaves would soon move along these connections. Like every major contemporary society, the Islamic world had a great need for slaves, and quickly found that the rural Berbers of North Africa were not enough to satisfy the demands of their interconnected world. In time, they would also become suppliers to Christian Europe as well. There were 6 main routes utilized in the Trans-Saharan trade, and each was, at various times, bound to the power of various kingdoms. The westernmost trade route ran from modern-day Ghana to Morocco, and was initially established by traders working with the Ghanaian Empire. Later, another trade route from the famous city of Timbuktu in Mali sold slaves that mostly ended up in Algeria, all under the protection of a succession of powerful medieval empires, like the Mali Empire and the Songhai. The Niger Valley was a third major source of slaves, primarily to Libya. The Lake Chad Basin also supplied Libya with slaves, chiefly funneled through the successive empires of Kanem and Bornu in Central Africa. There were also land routes from Sudan into Egypt, and last but not least, a significant trade of slaves along the Nile from Sudan and Ethiopia into Egypt. The conversion of sub-Saharan African kingdoms to Islam intensified the trade. Firstly, the conversion of the rulers and ruling ethnic groups created a clear distinction between Muslims and non-Muslims, the latter of which could be enslaved under Islamic law. Secondly, pilgrimages to Mecca encouraged rulers to make safe routes across the Sahara that doubled as avenues for the slave trade. The scale of the trade fluctuated over time. During the medieval period, an average of about 10,000 slaves were transported across the Trans-Saharan routes. These slaves ended up across the Muslim world and beyond, in North Africa, the Levant, Iran, Arabia, and Anatolia, and eventually, especially during the Mughal period, sub-Saharan Africans could end up as far as India. Some would also end up in Europe, chiefly Muslim-controlled Spain, until the Europeans began acquiring their own African slaves directly from the 16th century. Selection, acquisition, and transportation were the starting points of the trade. Islamic law forbade a Muslim from enslaving another Muslim. In reality, this did happen on occasion, but it was not tenable to create a mass market of Muslim slaves. In the case of Trans-Saharan trade, the slaves were overwhelmingly African pagans. On top of the religious difference, race was a component of slavery as well, although much less important to Saharan trade than later Atlantic trade. Black Africans were labeled Zanj or Sudan to distinguish them from the Arabs or North African Muslims, and there was a widespread acceptance that skin color was a sufficient basis for enslavement. Not all black Africans involved in the trade were themselves slaves, of course. As the Europeans did in Atlantic slavery, the Arab traders relied mostly on the African kingdoms in the slaving areas to acquire slaves for them. States like the Malian Empire or the Kanem Empire subdued and enslaved surrounding tribes and minor kingdoms, retaining some of the slaves for domestic use and selling others to trans-Saharan traders. With the conversion to Islam of many of these kingdoms, they added a religious justification to the expansion of their empires and the enslavement of their enemies. The Empire of Kanem and its successor Empire of Bornu were typical examples of how a state might sustain itself through trans-Saharan trade. These empires stretched across the Central Sahara, reaching from Libya down to modern-day Cameroon, creating a reliable passageway for slave trading. Their wars and conquests created many slaves that could then be sold on to the Arab merchants. Cities like the now-lost Njimi became centers of trade where slaves, along with other important goods like ivory and gold, would be bought up by trans-Saharan traders. These empires also secured the trade routes from raiders and built rest stops along the route to ease the burden of traveling merchants, in exchange for extracting taxes and custom duties from passing traders. The scale of slave trading contributed to the rise of many cities across Africa. Cities like Njimi and Timbuktu became important centers through their role in the slave trade. Meanwhile, in northern Africa, settlements like Sijil Massa in Morocco, Ghat in Libya, or Asyut in Egypt gained importance as markets for slaves brought along the trans-Saharan routes. Transport across the Sahara was done on foot in massive caravans, composed of camels, merchants, overseers, and bound slaves. They relied on local knowledge from Berbers and other desert peoples to navigate to the life-saving oases that made the journey possible. The Moroccan traveler Ibn Battuta joined one such march, from Mali to Morocco in 1354, where 600 female slaves were made to march for almost 3 months before reaching slave markets in Sijil Massa. Thanks to exhaustion, searingly hot days, cold nights, limited supplies, and the chance that oases would run dry, casualty rates were understandably massive. One European explorer estimated that out of every 4 slaves that began the trans-Saharan journey, only 1 reached the other side. Not all estimates agree on that though, and it certainly varied by region, route, and time period. Slaves trudging across the Central Sahara during summer must have had a higher death rate than those taken from Sudan along the Nile, for example. Still, like in the Atlantic Passage, a substantial portion of slaves would have met a miserable end before reaching their destination. Even if they survived, the life that awaited them was usually one of servitude and suffering. One of the grimmest realities of trans-Saharan slavery was the castration of men. A substantial number of male slaves were castrated before arriving in the Islamic world. Since castration was technically illegal, it had to be performed before entering Muslim territory. That meant quick and crude castration far from civilization, often resulting in deaths from infection and blood loss. Some estimates put the fatality rate at 60% or higher, but the high value of even a single eunuch slave made up for the relatively cheap cost of catching and castrating several who would never make it. There were several reasons for castration. It was seen as a way to emasculate the male slaves and make them less likely to rebel. It also deprived them of the chance to start a family, meaning they would not have conflicting loyalties. Another reason was that since so many slaves were domestic slaves and thus had close access to the woman of a household, castration eliminated the risk of improper sexual activity. Throughout history and all over the world, the idea of a noble woman seeking her pleasure with a male slave was hardly unheard of. After all, it was almost expected for men to sexually exploit female slaves, so why would it be any different the other way around? The primary use for slaves was domestic slavery. Elites would maintain a number of slaves to perform daily tasks on their estates, like cleaning, gardening, and servants' work. This was especially true for female slaves, who often ended up in forms of sexual slavery. While prostitution was frowned upon, Islamic law did allow for the ownership of maziyat, or concubines, and slaves provided a vast supply of them. As a result, most young women in the slave system found themselves sold for their bodies and the sexual gratification of elite men. An 11th century slave-buying manual by the Baghdadi scholar Ibn Butlan describes how the girls were sold and selected en masse. Sellers prided themselves on offering customers girls from all corners of the world, from sub-Saharan Africans to Indians to Europeans, all to cater to the desires of their new owners. The fate of most of these girls was a life of exploitation by a minor noble or official, then relegated to a sheltered life in the harem or domestic work after their master lost interest. A small number of these concubines, those who ended up in the power of the caliph or a powerful sultan, might enjoy a comfortable life. This was especially true if they birthed a son and became a al-walad, mother of the child. However, while some concubines did rise to have formidable powers in court, they were almost entirely Arabs or Persian in origin, not from sub-Saharan Africa. Agricultural labor was another common destination for slaves, although this was mostly men. Tunisia had an especially high concentration of slave labor working on agricultural estates, but they could be found as far away as Bahrain, which reported around 30,000 black slaves on farms there in the 10th century. Morocco's sugar industry also relied upon sub-Saharan African slaves for labor, which led the Moroccan Sultan Ahmad al-Mansur to launch an invasion across the Sahara to conquer the Songhai Empire and take direct control of the vital slave routes that originated there. Male slaves could also become soldiers. Islamic prohibitions on spilling the blood of fellow believers encouraged Muslim rulers to acquire large armies of non-Muslims to settle things on the battlefield. These slave soldiers were called Mamluks and could earn a surprisingly comfortable life for themselves if they survived and fought well, and many earned their freedom through their work. The Sultan al-Salih Ayyub of Cairo was possibly the largest single purchaser of slaves in history, and assembled an army of Mamluks so massive that after his death in 1249, these Mamluks were able to seize power and establish the Mamluk Sultanate that stood for over 2 centuries. The best hope for a slave was for freedom by manumission. In theory, slaves who converted to Islam should usually be manumitted, although the practical ability of slaves to have their conversion recognized or the law enforced was not so reliable. In most cases, manumission came as a reward for a particularly loyal slave, or was bestowed in the will of a deceased slave owner. The Quran permits slavery, but it also recognizes the freeing of slaves as a virtuous act in itself. The Quran also explicitly calls for all slave owners to offer slaves the chance to buy their own freedom, which many did achieve, although this would usually take years of work. The Trans-Saharan trade continued unabated throughout the Renaissance and even into the modern period. The arrival of Europeans did little to slow the trade, as they mostly opened their own networks from the western coasts while the Arabs monopolized inland trade. The abolition of Atlantic slavery had some influence on the course of trans-Saharan trade. The 19th century was the most intense period of trans-Saharan slavery, with around 1.2 million slaves in those 100 years. It appears that, following the abolition of Atlantic trade, states and societies geared towards slavery chose to sell to the Arab traders instead of the European ones. In the latter half of the 19th century, the European zeal for abolition was used to justify colonization of slave-trading African kingdoms, which deprived the Trans-Saharan traders of their suppliers. The new colonizers were not pleased at the idea of slave raiders kidnapping their new colonial subjects either, and so Arab slave raids also slowed. Britain used diplomatic pressure to force the abolition of slavery in Tunisia in 1846, and the Ottomans conceded some abolition in Libya in the 1850s. Alongside France's abolition of slavery in Algeria in 1848, the market for trans-Saharan slave trading was severely reduced, but not eliminated. The Ottoman Empire still allowed slavery in most of its territory, and continued to export slaves to the Middle East into the 20th century, but the sharply rising prices of those slaves showed the declining supply. Meanwhile, in Iran, the population of Tehran was still 12% black slaves as late as 1868, and an estimated 80,000 black slaves were still present in Iran in the mid-19th century. A combination of abolition and colonization brought the Trans-Saharan trade to a close gradually. Technological changes like the introduction of railways and the improvement of steamships also reduced the need for vast caravan trains across the desert. While we cannot point to a single date where the last Trans-Saharan slave caravan traveled, it's safe to say that any significant slave trade across the Sahara had been all but eliminated by the 20th century. The end of the Trans-Saharan slave trade brought to a close a system that had stood for over 1,000 years. In its wake, the trade left an indelible mark on its victims. Kingdoms rose and societies collapsed in the face of the demands of the trade. Millions were taken from their homes, and many of those were castrated, prevented from ever forming families or communities that would remember their story. Slavery itself outlasted the Trans-Saharan trade in many of the places it involved. Countries like Libya, Morocco, Mali, and Niger still face major problems of domestic and sexual slavery that persist to this day. They joined the estimated 6 to 10 million victims of one of the longest-lasting slave trading networks in history, and like their historical forebears, are all too easily forgotten.
From the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli are the beginning lines from the United States Marine Corps hymn, and the Tripoli that's mentioned is the largest city in today's Libya. The hymn was written sometime after 1867, and these lines commemorate two of the Marine Corps' most famous battles: the halls of Montezuma, referring to the Mexican-American War of 1846 to 48, and the shores of Tripoli refers to the battles the Marine Corps, along with the U.S. Navy, fought with the infamous Barbary pirates, who terrorized the coast of North Africa, the Mediterranean Sea, and indeed a large part of Europe, for 3 centuries. If interesting and little-known topics like this interest you, please like this video and subscribe to our channel so that we can bring you more great content. The Barbary coast of North Africa stretches from eastern Morocco to Tripoli, just under 1,000 miles. The name Barbary has nothing to do with barbarians. Barbary is the anglicized version of Berber, the native non-Arab peoples of the region. The Berbers had been famous warriors and raiders by land when they and their allies decided to take to the sea in the late 1400s and early 1500s. Many of the Berber tribes were joined by refugees, both Muslim and Jewish, who were either fleeing or being forced out of Spain, as the Spanish, under Ferdinand and Isabella, carried out the Reconquista, the reconquest of much of Spain after 7 centuries of Arab-Muslim rule. The trade of countless nations flowed across, around, and out of the Mediterranean, and the Barbary pirates wanted their piece of it. Spices, gold, gems, and much else from the Middle East and India were carried over the waves of the Mediterranean. So were food items, wine, raw materials, and much else from Europe. The ships carrying these goods were one of the prime targets of the pirates. But the most lucrative good wasn't pepper from India or frankincense from Persia, it was human beings. Slavery had existed in the Mediterranean Basin since before the time of Rome. During the Roman expansion, people from all corners of the empire were enslaved. Franks, Germans, Slavs, Greeks, various people from the Balkans, Africans traded to Rome by Egypt, Jews from Israel, and more. Some of the richest people in Rome and the Gothic and Arab empires which followed it were slave traders. Many Viking raiders grew rich and powerful from the treasure they hoarded trading slaves. Slavery was common in Europe, the north coast of Africa, and the Middle East until relatively recent times. In the 1500s, the Ottoman Turks expanded along the North African coast. Due to distance and the fiercely independent nature of the Berbers and others, however, Ottoman control of the Barbary coast was nominal. As long as the people there recognized the Ottoman Sultan as their overlord and gave help when it was asked, the Turks left the people of the coast alone. One of the many interesting things about the Barbary pirate is that, as time went on, many of them were not from the region. Many were Europeans, acting much like today's mercenaries, looking for adventure and a quick buck. Unfortunately, what they were mainly looking for were other human beings to sell into slavery. At first, the Barbary pirates confined themselves to the Mediterranean Basin. This was done out of necessity, because for more than a century, the ships that the Barbary pirates traveled in were galleys. You might be familiar with the galley. In virtually all movies about ancient Greece and Rome, the ships you see are galleys, powered by slaves rowing their lives away. Though some of these movies and some Roman galleys did have sails, these were basic square sails. They weren't the main source of the ship's propulsion. They just added speed when the wind was right, for the ancients lacked the technology and the knowledge to tack into the wind. So likely millions of human beings around the world toiled away at the oars. By the mid-1500s, many areas of the western Mediterranean coastline of Europe were abandoned. The raids of the Barbary corsairs, another term for pirate, especially those of the Barbary coast, had been so successful in raiding that those left fled inland for greater protection. One of the most infamous of the Barbary raids took place more than 1,000 miles away, on the coast of Ireland. In 1631, the Barbary corsairs landed on the coast of Western Ireland and, during the night, raided the village of Baltimore, taking dozens of slaves. The village remained empty for decades. It would have been foolish for the pirates to raid the Channel coast of England or look for rich, slow-moving merchant ships there, but English ships trading off the coast of France and in the Mediterranean were prime targets. In the 7 years between 1609 and 1616, the English lost 466 ships to the pirates. That is a huge number. It not only shows the size of the English merchant fleet, but the size and activity of the Barbary pirates. And when you stop to consider that English ships were not the only ones seized, you have a group of very skilled, very rich pirates. Before we tell you more about who many of the slaves were who were taken by the corsairs, let's stop for a moment and explain what happened to them. For able-bodied men that were seized, a life of hard labor awaited. This could mean working in various mines along the Barbary coast, which borders the Sahara Desert. You understand. Thirsty work, to say the least. Other men who knew something about shipbuilding might be put to work doing that, or many of the other menial tasks that daily life consisted of at the time. The worst fate for men was to be a galley slave. The life of a galley slave was most often quite short and extremely miserable. Men were placed at the oars, chained to the deck and to the oars, and never allowed to leave. Never. That meant that in addition to rowing everywhere, and often being beaten or whipped by the crew while doing so, the enslaved rower would take his meals at the oars, and meals likely consisted of fish remains and rotting vegetables. Galley slaves remained at the oars in all weather. They did not have cushions to sit on. Worst of all, galley slaves were never unchained to relieve themselves. They did so at the oars. Their benches and bodies became coated with waste until a hard rain, or the crew finally doused them with water because of the stench. As you can likely imagine, the constant friction of their skin on the oars, their feet on the deck, their buttocks and thighs on the benches meant that the slaves often had open cuts and/or raw skin. In turn, this meant widespread infection, fever, disease, and death. It also meant gangrene and maggots eating away at you while you were rowing and being whipped. Though it takes place in Roman times, the epic movie Ben-Hur illustrates well the life of a galley slave. Not only was the life of an enslaved rower miserable, it was also, at times, filled with terror. Though by the 1500s galleys had started to carry smaller, primitive cannons, their existence depended on getting within grappling distance of their foes and pulling their ship towards the enemy. All the while, the slaves sat and waited while combat took place around them, and if that was not enough, if the ship went down, so did the slaves, chained to their benches. People who take slaves are not generally moral people. In the overwhelming number of cases, slavers throughout history took surrendered and captured enemies, raided lands nearby, and/or bought slaves of many different races and ethnicities. Slaves had been taken in Africa for untold centuries. Africans took Africans, Arabs took Africans, and when Europeans began to journey to the continent, they took slaves. Some of them went to Europe, but the majority were sent to the Americas, where there was no sizable European workforce, at least not at first. The story of slavery in the United States is a long and complicated one, filled with notions of racial superiority to justify the practice of capturing and breeding millions of people for centuries. However, this video is about the pirates and slaves of the Barbary corsairs. There are a number of unusual things about the Barbary pirates. They were not just Berbers. In their later history, many were not. No, in addition to the Berber captains were Arabs, Turks, Dutch, Greeks, and even a number of cases like that of Jack Ward, an English Barbary pirate in the early 1600s. One famous pirate was an Arab Muslim woman named Sayyida al-Hur, who became governor of a district of Morocco and was later the wife of its sultan. At a time when Muslim religious tolerance exceeded that of Europe, even a small number of Jewish men became pirates. One such being Sinan Reis, who rescued the son of the most famous Barbary captain, Hayreddin Barbarossa, known in the Mediterranean from the English translation, Redbeard. In 2004, Ohio State University history professor Robert C. Davis published Christian Slaves, Muslim Master, which drew notice for its story of how European slaves made their way into the slave pens of the Barbary coast and the Ottoman Empire. Davis's method of calculating the number of white slaves taken is mathematically sound, though many have said that his formula only takes an average number for every year for more than 2 centuries. By Davis's calculations, at least 1.5 million European slaves were taken from the coastal villages and ships in the Mediterranean Basin and as far afield as Ireland, as you heard in the case of Baltimore. Men were sent to hard labor in the mines, galleys, or the fields. Women were sorted by attractiveness and health. Those deemed unattractive were made to do work in the kitchen, fields, and homes. Attractive women and girls were sent to various important figures for their harem, including for the Sultan of Sultans in Istanbul. Children were often taken and raised as Muslims, some of those making their way into the famous Janissaries, an Ottoman version of the Roman Praetorian Guard. From the middle 1600s on, various European nations waged war on the Barbary pirates. This was done not only to stop the taking of European slaves, and, note, the European slavery of Africans continued, but to stop the pirates' seizure of important and valuable commodities such as olive oil and cotton from Egypt. One nation who took particular offense to the Barbary pirates' raids was the United States. The United States fought 2 wars, the First and Second Barbary Wars, to stop the seizure of trade goods bound for the new nation, and to stop the seizure of American sailors to sell in the slave markets. Interestingly enough, the Sultan of Morocco had been among the first to recognize the USA, and Moroccan pirates were forbidden to attack U.S. ships. The U.S. allied with Sweden in the Second Barbary War, 1815, to inflict a heavy defeat on the pirates, and piracy in the Mediterranean went into a rapid decline.
Slavery has existed in many different forms throughout history. The reduction of another human being to the status of property used for labor at the command of another has been a feature of almost every society on Earth until the 19th century or so. No system of slavery has attracted more attention than the transatlantic slave trade, established by Europeans to provide slave labor for their American colonies. Around 12 million souls were taken from Africa and forced onto perilous journeys across the Atlantic, where they and their descendants were condemned to a life of servitude. However, retellings of the horrors of Atlantic slavery too often turn into stories of how Europeans alone determined the course of that history. In reality, Africans were not just passive victims. Millions of them were slaves, but many others profited from, produced, and protected that slave trade. In this video, we look at the untold story of the African slave trade. Stick around until the end to learn how some of Africa's greatest kingdoms were built on the profits of slavery, and how Africans fought tooth and nail to protect it from the abolitionist European empires. Slavery has existed in Africa for as long as recorded history. Ancient Egypt had slaves toiling away in its fields and on its monuments. Ancient Carthage trafficked in slaves across the Mediterranean, and the Ethiopian kings of Aksum wrote proudly of the slaves they took in war. Slaves were also exported from Africa for centuries before Europeans arrived. The Trans-Saharan Slave Trade lasted for over 1,000 years and dragged about 10 million people across the desert to be slaves in the Islamic world. The Indian Ocean also had a similarly long-lasting ocean-going slave trade, with about 5 million ending up in slave ships, bound and branded for use in foreign lands. These slaves ended up as laborers, domestic servants, soldiers, or more. Male slaves in the Islamic world were typically castrated, which meant that new slaves had to be regularly imported to maintain the population. For this video, we'll focus on Western Africa, where the Atlantic slave trade was centered. West Africa was removed from the Indian Ocean trade and mostly secure from Islamic slave raids, but slavery was still a feature of life there long before the Atlantic slave trade began. A succession of powerful empires occupied the region, which all rested on complex slave systems. The Ghanaian Empire from the 3rd to the 13th century began a tradition of powerful West African imperial states and built much of its wealth through trans-Saharan trading of slaves or goods acquired through slave labor. The salt, copper, and gold that made the Mali Empire and Mansa Musa fabulously wealthy were all extracted with slave labor. Domestic slavery was also common, and Mali was known to import female slaves from the Mediterranean to act as domestic servants in the households of the elites. Most of the slaves were acquired through conquest of neighboring kingdoms, or tribal groups who were too weak to defend themselves from the organized imperial militaries. Successor empires like the Songhay, Jolof, and Kabu inherited the social and economic structures of slavery and continued to acquire slaves as they scrambled to establish their own territories. Elites in these empires used slaves as a status symbol, and ownership of slaves came to represent someone's wealth and power. Slavery took many different forms in West Africa. Some worked the land or the mines, others served as soldiers or even political advisors. In some places, slaves were permitted to own land that they cultivated in their free time and might earn enough from this land to buy their own freedom. In other places, the lot of slaves was more miserable. In Benin, for example, slaves were regularly sacrificed to mark important occasions like the anniversary of a king's death. All of this is to say that when Europeans arrived, they did not find an empty land of scattered peoples ripe for enslavement, but complex societies and slave-holding empires whose roots were even older than those of the Europeans themselves. The Atlantic slave trade was started by the Portuguese in the mid-15th century. Originally, slaves were taken to Europe, but this changed in 1526, when the first Portuguese ships carried slaves across the Atlantic to their new American colonies. However, the vision of Europeans landing on an African shore, frightening a tribe of natives into submission, and dragging them in chains to their ship is not representative of what happened for most slaves. Some slaves were indeed taken in European slave raids, but the vast majority were sold to the Europeans by other Africans. The European arrival in West Africa came at the same time as the collapse of the Mali Empire. Various splinter states scrambled over each other to seize territory for themselves. The Europeans with their firearms offered these competing rulers a potential advantage over their enemies. In turn, the huge amounts of captives that these kingdoms acquired in their wars were useful currency to trade with the Europeans. Additionally, the other goods like cloth and ceramics that the Europeans brought were status symbols that the new African elite could use to showcase their wealth and power. Different peoples responded in different ways to the opportunities of European slave trading. The Kingdom of Congo made contact with Portuguese explorers in 1483 and traded thousands of slaves every year. The slaving relationship between the two powers was sophisticated and mutually beneficial. For example, Congolese King Alfonso I saw the Portuguese as a useful outlet for the excess slaves he acquired during his expansionary wars, and he was an eager participant in slave trading. However, he also asserted his own power over it in 1526 by forcing Portugal to submit to his legal framework for slavery, which governed how exactly someone might be enslaved and provided protections for those who were not legitimately enslaved, mostly his own subjects taken by criminal raiders or opportunists. A similar enthusiasm was seen among the various Akan peoples of modern Nigeria. They occupied an area known as the Gold Coast and were similarly prolific as both sellers and purchasers of slave labor. The gold mines that made the Akan so wealthy in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries were filled by slaves they purchased from both African and European merchants. As many as a third of the population of the various Akan states were enslaved people. In almost every case, these slaves were from non-Akan ethnic groups. Any sense of African solidarity in the face of European slave trading was almost non-existent. The ethnic divides that split Africa were far older than European contact and would not be quickly changed by the arrival of foreigners on their shores. There was, of course, resistance. Many European slave ships were attacked by coastal raiders, but these reactions were rare and relatively ineffective. Most of the time, these were small-scale attacks by small tribes, or villages near where the Europeans dropped anchor. It was these tiny, disconnected groups who were most vulnerable to slavery, and their shows of defiance rarely saved them in the end. One state that did turn against European slaving was the Kingdom of Benin. The Kingdom of Benin was not the Benin we know today, but a small territory in modern-day Nigeria. Initially a partner in slave trading, by the mid-16th century, the kingdom was facing a serious drain on population, especially among its men. Two rulers, Oba Esigie and Oba Orhobuga, are credited with ending Benin's participation in Atlantic slave trading and closed Benin's ports to European traders. Slavery was not abolished in the country. In fact, the Kingdom of Benin would fight to uphold domestic slavery against Britain in the late 19th century. But this kingdom shows that Africans responded in many different ways to slavery. Each kingdom and ethnic group assessed their own situations and reacted accordingly, whether that was to sell slaves or prohibit it as they saw fit. Of all the slaving states of Africa, none is more infamous than Dahomey. First emerging around 1600 along the southern coast of modern-day Nigeria, Dahomey soared to prominence under the warrior king Agaja in the early 18th century. Dahomey's ace in the hole was a well-trained and well-organized standing army, perhaps as large as 50,000 men or more at its height, which Agaja used to conquer the kingdoms of Alada and Ouida in the 1720s. Alada and Ouida were prolific slave trading kingdoms, with tens of thousands of slaves passing through their ports. Dahomey's consolidated control of so many slave ports made it one of the most formidable slaving powers in history. The colossal army pushed Dahomey towards slavery for two additional reasons. Firstly, its military culture discouraged men from non-military careers, meaning that slaves were needed to carry out other jobs like agriculture. Secondly, a standing army had to be kept occupied or else it might grow restless and rebel. So Dahomey was constantly attacking other neighboring powers or sending out slave raids to bring back captives. The result was a colossal slave population. According to some estimates, by the 19th century, 2/3 of the kingdom's population were enslaved people. Slavery was so endemic to Dahomeyan society that one scholar remarked it's difficult to determine whether Dahomey was a slaving gang turned into a state or a state that existed purely for the sake of slaving. Slaves weren't just laborers and domestic servants in Dahomey, but became woven into the political fabric of the society. Ownership of slaves became a status symbol for Dahomeyan elites, as it did for others in West Africa. This led to tension between the king and the elites who fought for control over the slave trade. Although it is often characterized as a royal monopoly, even the absolute power of the monarch was not enough to rein in elites who established power bases of their own thanks to their trading of slaves. Slaves also became a part of Dahomeyan religion. The annual customs of Dahomey were a day of rituals and public celebration involving military parades, political debates, and human sacrifice of slaves to appease the spirits and protect the kingdom for another year. Hundreds of slaves were killed, usually with decapitation, and in some years as many as 4,000 people were sacrificed on a single day. A similar display of mass sacrifice was required for the funeral of a king, and might occur on a smaller scale for any number of other rituals or social events. Dahomey remained committed to slavery even as the European powers began their crusade against it. In 1818, King Gezo was forced to make concessions to the British, including the abolition of slave sacrifices, and by the 1840s, Gezo was being pressured to end the slave trade altogether, but he refused. "The slave trade is the ruling principle of my people," Gezo told the British. "It is the source and glory of their wealth. the mother lulls the child to sleep with notes of triumph over an enemy reduced to slavery. When the British managed to force a treaty on Gezo that ended slave trading from Dahomey's ports, it was a source of bitter resentment. The Dahomeyans subverted it by selling slaves overland to be sold through ports not bound by the treaty's terms. Eventually, the resentment caused a total breakdown of relations, and Dahomey abandoned the treaty entirely by the late 1850s. They pivoted towards an alliance with France, who were less zealous in their anti-slavery attitudes, but the collapse of the slave trade would soon bring down the kingdom. As the kingdom's main source of wealth failed, it was forced into desperate raiding and conquest that antagonized the French. After attacking a French allied town in 1889, France waged 2 wars against Dahomey, citing its penchant for slavery as a legitimizing moral cause, and toppled the kingdom in 1894. A common misconception about European imperialism in Africa is that colonization and slavery always worked hand in hand. The Europeans set down their claims in Africa to furnish their endless desire for slaves. This was true at certain times. Portugal's colonies, such as those in Angola, were an important source of slaves. By the late 1700s, Portugal's thirst for able-bodied male slaves to work their American plantations meant that Angolan women outnumbered men in their homeland by at least 2 to 1. However, the vast majority of European colonization in Africa occurred after the abolition of slavery. It would be more accurate to say that anti-slavery motivated European colonization. We have already seen how France conquered Dahomey in part to end its slave trading. A similarly hard line against slavery was taken by the British. For example, in 1851, the Royal Navy lay siege to the Nigerian city of Lagos and its king Costco because the king refused to end the slave trade. After a furious naval bombardment, the British compelled Lagos to abolish the trade, forcibly freed every slave in Lagos's territory, and expelled all slave traders from their land. The British later imposed abolition on all of Nigeria. Some historians have noted that while Britain was quick to abolish trading, domestic slavery took a lot longer to root out in Nigeria. The British were concerned that moving too quickly to end slavery there would provoke unrest and resistance from the Nigerians themselves. Abolitionism was similarly evident in the British conquest of Benin in 1897. After the massacre of a British merchant expedition in January of that year, the British launched a punitive military strike against Benin City. Slavery was once again among the justifying causes of the attack and subsequent colonization of the kingdom. According to eyewitness accounts, the king of Benin sacrificed hundreds of his slaves in hopes of acquiring divine protections against the approaching British. The British repopulated the decimated city with freed slaves and offered total emancipation and resettlement to any slave who escaped to their territory. Benin's elites were slow to embrace the change, and British authorities were still trying to stamp out native slavery there into the 1920s. That is not to say that there weren't African abolitionists. There certainly were, not least of all the slaves themselves. But there were many in Africa willing to fight and die to uphold the ancient institution. No discussion of slavery should ever gloss over the fact that millions of Africans suffered unspeakable cruelty across the Atlantic, Indian Ocean, the Sahara, or in Africa itself. The scale of the deportations from Africa deserves unique attention, but that suffering was not solely the product of foreigners imposing themselves on a passive continent. Africans were active in their own history and helped to create, expand, and uphold the systems of slavery that shackled other Africans. The story of Africa's support for slavery is as much a part of its history as its being a victim of it. While the experiences of millions of African slaves deserves all the attention it gets, that doesn't mean we should pretend that other Africans were not traders, raiders, and rulers who facilitated the enslavement of others on their continent. Africa was not uniquely guilty or innocent of slavery, but part of a shared human story of suffering, exploitation, and eventually abolition. Telling that history gets us closer to the truth and puts African history in its rightful place in world history, as a continent full of people who are as complicated and flawed as anyone else. If you appreciated this dive into the untold parts of African slavery, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more historical content like this.